as elected officials to plot and plan against us. That's the irony of this. As I said, it violates what you were saying on that tape, violates the absolute spirit of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, without which you couldn't have been there as elected officials. Louis Martinez wouldn't have been president of the city council. You wouldn't have been the leader of the state senate, were it not for the struggle and the sacrifices of black people, and then for those black people to hear y'all on the tape talking about us in that way. That's a lot to process. That's a lot to swallow, man.
Now, before anyone gets carried away, let's not make a saint out of a sinner. Tavis Smiley beat around the bush, but tried to make it sound like he wasn't. He made a few good points, but nothing extraordinary. The problem is Tavis Smiley is slavishly following the white media narrative that the whole racism scandal in the LA City Council is only about Nuri Martinez and her 3 other racist pals in that room. Smiley talks as if it goes no deeper and no further than the 4 of them, and once DeLeon is sent packing, that will be the end of it. You know, for a guy who likes to talk about systemic racism, he seems too dense to realize that there's systemic anti-black racism that's been going on in LA, and a lot of it has been coming from the Hispanic community. And he seems terrified to have that conversation, even though the Hispanic community themselves have admitted it. Tavis didn't want to say that. The activists in LA are saying it. The Hispanic community themselves are saying it. You cannot honestly say that you want to talk about this incident without being brutally honest about why it happened in the first place, and Smiley went out of his way to avoid that. The reason he's so uncomfortable is because he spent his entire life avoiding the simple truth that the black grassroots have been saying all along. White supremacy is not based on anti-Hispanic bigotry or anti-Asian bigotry or anti-Semitism or anti-Indian sentiment or any of those other things. White supremacy is based on one thing and one thing only: anti-black racism. And what that means is these other non-black groups out there, well, they don't really have the same motivation to fight white supremacy as we do, because as white power has shown over the last 500 years, it can incorporate these non-white groups to be buffers to reinforce anti-black racism. Whether it be the Irish and the Germans in the 19th century, the Italians, the Jews, and the Southern Europeans in the 20th century, and more recently we've seen these techniques used regarding Asians and Hispanics. Now, the problem for Tavis Smiley is when you've spent your life looking for allies that didn't exist, then you just can't let it go, and that's his problem. He's still holding out for that great racial alliance, but that's not all. He's also desperately hoping that he can get his old job back at PBS. He's been kicked out of the walled city, but he thinks if he just shows he's willing to play the game, they'll let him back in, eventually. But he knows if he's going to have even a snowball's chance of that happening, he better talk a certain way, and he also better not talk a certain way. Well, you cannot knock out anti-black racism if you're going to pull your punches. This is not a hard conversation to have at all, but if your goal is to make sure that nobody is uncomfortable with you, especially at the group level, well, that's going to make it impossible. Nuri Martinez and Kevin DeLeon, they didn't just sprout out of the ground. They were the product of a specific environment. And unless we talk about that environment, nothing is going to change. Even the LA Times has been forced to have to admit to the racism problem that's come out of Latin America. But why weren't they reporting on it before now? Because they didn't have to wait until this happened. The problem is this exploded so big and it was undeniable they were forced to have to acknowledge it. The LA Times recently reported on how in Mexico you have people who are finally admitting to the rampant colorism and white privilege in their society. But the article points out that this was the result of what black people did in the United States in 2020. We need to understand that by and large, we are pretty much the only ones fighting white supremacy. Everyone else is just trying to find a comfortable place under it. This is why racist regimes all over the world get terrified when they see black people in the US standing up and fighting back, because they know that we have a unique legitimacy that no one else has. There is no substitute for the moral authority of the black population of the United States. There is no substitute for the moral legitimacy that we represent. We are the ones who the rest of the world looks to for ideas and trends. They deny it, and at the same time, they also copy us. That's how it works. Now, a large part of why Latin America has all of this anti-black racism going on that's not being challenged is because there never was a civil rights movement down there. And as we can see with the white ruling class in those countries, they're absolutely determined that's not going to be allowed to happen. So why didn't it happen in Latin America? Well, that's because when the Spanish showed up, they used the same trick that the Catholic Church used when it went into non-white countries. They told everyone that they didn't care about race, that, oh, we're all just one big happy dysfunctional family, while at the same time they were enslaving and oppressing only black people. Afro-Latinos know that Latin culture is racist. A few of them have admitted it. Now they'll say it in passing, but at least a few of them have actually said it. The problem for a lot of them is they do know that they have a Spaniard in their family tree somewhere, usually someone who raped one of their ancestors, or they perhaps have some Blanco more recently who wanted a quick roll in the hay. And what this means is for a lot of them, since racial equality is not attainable, they instead look for interracial sexual access because, at least for some of them, that is attainable. And that's where a lot of this confusion comes in. But those white supremacists who are running those countries down in Latin America, they're not confused at all. So when these attempts to circumvent anti-black racism by the Afro-Latinos and the mestizos and the Indios fail, rather than admit to the reality, they instead dig in their heels and double down on the delusion that their problem is class, not race. Because for them, it's simply too painful to admit that some of those white in-laws or relatives that they like to believe they have cannot stand them. They don't want to have to admit to that. All the people of these Latin countries are blood relatives, at least that's the rhetoric that's used, but then they turn right around and treat their relatives like dogs based on their skin color. They don't want to have to admit to that. So how do you fight racism in a region where nobody wants to admit that it exists? The answer? You don't. This has led to an enormous amount of internalized racism in Latin America. That's how you get someone like the brown-skinned Nuri Martinez, who is dogging out other people who come from the exact same country as her, speak the same language as her, have the same culture as her. And she's trying to find a way to magnify herself over other Hispanics, claiming that these people are brown people when she herself is brown. She ain't white. See, the problem for people like Nuri Martinez is in Latin America, the Blanco ruling class doesn't allow people like her to classify herself as white. Yeah, she can sit there and pine away for it and wish that she could be and tell herself that she basically is a darker shade of white, but they don't allow that down there. Either you're one of the Blancos or you're not, and she's not. But in the United States, on the other hand, where white supremacy is more sophisticated and refined, they have no problem taking some of these other groups and making buffers out of them. So that means they'll go ahead and let a Nuri Martinez show up or a Kevin DeLeon, and they can get a driver's license and they can identify as white on their driver's license, but white supremacy is not fooled. So that brings us to another important point that nobody talks about. Why is it that a Nuri Martinez or a Kevin DeLeon, who are brown-skinned, will simultaneously claim to be both white and people of color? Why does that happen? Well, Hispanics themselves have explained it. They don't ever say, we're not white. Instead, they say they're just not Anglo. This is how Hispanics themselves describe the difference between themselves and white society. Again, this is a class-based argument, and it strikes at the core of what is called white adjacent. This is how you have someone like Alexandria Cortez, who got on Meet the Press and said she has black ancestry, but that doesn't make her black. She also said, I've got Indian ancestry, but that doesn't make me an Indian. But she didn't dare say that I've got Spanish ancestry, but that doesn't make me white. She didn't say that. So she says, yeah, I got black ancestry, but I'm not black. Oh, she made sure she said that first, because she identifies as white. That's how she sees herself. As far as she's concerned, she's a white woman of Spanish descent. This is the reality that Tavis Smiley didn't say anything about, not because he doesn't know, but as far as he's concerned, well, we don't want to upset the apple cart. As far as I'm concerned, Tavis Smiley did us absolutely no favors if he refuses to call the situation what it is. If he limits the entire discussion to just the four racists in that room, he has actually done us a disservice. The problem is a hell of a lot bigger than just Nuri Martinez and three other bigots spitballing anti-black racist strategy in a room somewhere. I think we're all honest enough to admit that Tavis Smiley is still holding that black-brown alliance card in reserve. And he figures that as soon as all this heat dies down, he'll go right back to playing that card all over again. Well, it's up to us to declare it game over. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Cloud Walker Z, Justin Marcus, Sandra Bates, Brian Ellis, and Chaz. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.